I was 24 when I was first appointed as an auxiliary pioneer. The letter came on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by Brother Matthews, our circuit overseer. My hands trembled as I read the official letterhead from the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. "Congratulations, Brother David," it began, "on your appointment to serve as an auxiliary pioneer for the months of April through September." I remember sitting in my small apartment in suburban Ohio, staring at that letter, feeling a mixture of pride and terror. This was it, my chance to really make a difference, to be on the front lines of the most important work in human history. At least, that's what I believed then. The night before my first day, I couldn't sleep. I kept rehearsing my presentation in my mind. "Good morning. We're here today because we love people and want them to survive the end of this system of things. May I share with you this important message from God's Word?" I had practiced it so many times that even now, 15 years later, I can recite it perfectly. My first morning of pioneer service began at 6:30 a.m. I drove to the Kingdom Hall, my book bag heavy with literature, my heart even heavier with anticipation. The other pioneers were already there. Sister Martinez, who had been pioneering for 12 years, Brother Johnson, a retired elder who spent his golden years in full-time service, and Sister Chen, a young single mother who somehow managed to balance pioneering with raising her 8-year-old son. "Remember," Brother Johnson said as we gathered for the service meeting, "we're not just going door to door. We're conducting a life-saving work. Every door we knock on could be someone's last chance to hear the truth before Armageddon." I believed him completely. Those first weeks were intoxicating. I threw myself into the work with the fervor of a true believer. I woke up at 5 a.m. every day, spent an hour in personal study, and was at the meeting place by 7 a.m. sharp. My book bag was perfectly organized. Current magazines in the front compartment, older literature in the back, and my worn copy of the Reasoning from the Scriptures book always within reach. I kept meticulous records. Not just the basic information required for the monthly report, hours, placements, return visits, studies, but detailed notes about every person I met. Mrs. Patterson on Elm Street, who lost her husband last year and seemed interested in our resurrection hope. The college student on Oak Avenue who asked thoughtful questions about evolution. The elderly man on Pine Street who invited us in for coffee and wanted to discuss Bible prophecy. Each person had a story, a face, a name. I genuinely cared about them. My favorite return visit was with Mrs. Irene Walsh, a 78-year-old widow who lived alone in a blue house on Maple Street. She had answered the door on my third week of pioneering, and something about her reminded me of my grandmother. She had the same kind eyes, the same gentle way of speaking. "Oh, you're the young man with the religious magazines," she said the first time I returned. Come in. I'll put the kettle on." Mrs. Walsh's living room was filled with photographs. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren scattered across the country. She would tell me about each one while we sipped tea from delicate china cups. Her husband had died 3 years earlier, and she was clearly lonely. "I don't know if I believe everything in your magazines," she would say, "but I do appreciate the company. You remind me of my grandson in California." I would share a scripture, leave a watchtower, and promise to return the following week. She always said she looked forward to it. "She loves the company," Brother Johnson would say whenever I reported on my visits with Mrs. Walsh, "but she'll never accept the truth. Some people are just too set in their ways." But I kept going anyway. Something about those Tuesday afternoon visits felt right, felt human. By my third month as a pioneer, I had developed a routine that felt natural. Monday mornings were for magazine work in the downtown business district. Tuesday afternoons were for return visits, including my weekly tea with Mrs. Walsh. Wednesday evenings were for street witnessing after the meeting. Thursday mornings were for rural territory, driving the back roads and visiting isolated farms. Friday was for Bible studies, though I only had one at the time. Saturday was for the group witnessing work, and Sunday afternoons were for informal witnessing after the meetings. It was during this period that I began to notice certain patterns in the work. There were the interested ones, people who would take literature, ask questions, and seem genuinely curious about our message. Then there were the not-at-homes, houses where no one answered, which we would revisit at different times. And finally, there were the do-not calls, people who had explicitly asked not to be contacted again. What struck me was how differently these categories were treated. The interested ones received our full attention and effort. The not-at-homes were systematically revisited until we either made contact or determined the house was likely vacant. But the do-not calls were often viewed with suspicion or disappointment. "They're rejecting their last chance," Sister Martinez would say about someone who had asked not to be visited again. It's really sad when people turn their backs on the truth. I began to wonder, if we truly loved these people, shouldn't we respect their wishes? If someone politely but firmly said they weren't interested, wasn't continuing to call on them more about our needs than theirs? These thoughts troubled me, but I pushed them aside. I was new to pioneering, still learning. The experienced brothers and sisters knew better than I did. My 4th month as a pioneer brought new challenges. The initial excitement had worn off, and the reality of needing to report 70 hours of field service each month began to weigh on me. Some days, I would spend more time driving between territories than actually witnessing. Other days, I would sit in my car for 10 minutes before approaching a house, trying to muster the motivation to knock on another door. It was during this period that I first heard about time padding, the practice of stretching out field service to meet hour requirements. It was never explicitly taught, but it was widely practiced. Starting the time clock when you left home for service, even if you wouldn't begin witnessing for another hour. Counting travel time between territories. Taking extended coffee breaks while officially in service. "You have to be smart about your time," Brother Johnson advised me one Thursday morning. "Every minute counts toward your report." I watched as he started his time at 8 a.m. when we met at the Kingdom Hall, even though we didn't make our first door-to-door call until 9:30 a.m. after driving to the territory and having coffee at McDonald's. When we stopped for lunch at noon, he kept his time running. When we took a 20-minute break to visit a brother in the hospital, he counted that as time too. "It's all related to the ministry," he explained. "We're encouraging our brother, which is part of our Christian work." I began to adopt similar practices, though they never sat well with me. I told myself it was necessary to meet the hour requirements, but I knew I was compromising my integrity. The pressure wasn't just about hours. There was also the constant emphasis on producing results. Circuit overseers would visit and ask about the number of Bible studies being conducted, the number of people attending meetings, the number of baptisms. Publishers who consistently had high numbers were praised and given additional privileges. Those who struggled were counseled and sometimes had privileges removed. "Remember," our circuit overseer said during his visit, "we're not just covering territory. We're looking for sheep-like ones who will accept the truth. Every study that doesn't progress to baptism represents a failure to properly cultivate the interest." I began to look at my return visits differently. Mrs. Walsh, who had been studying with me for 2 months but showed no signs of wanting to attend meetings, was becoming a problem. My study with the college student had stalled when he began asking difficult questions about the organization's history. The elderly man on Pine Street had stopped answering his door after I began pressing him to make a decision about the truth. Were these people I was trying to help, or were they statistics I was trying to improve? The turning point came on a humid Thursday morning in July. Brother Johnson and I were working a residential territory on the south side of town. The houses were modest, many showing signs of economic hardship. We had been out for 3 hours and had placed only 2 magazines. We approached a small house with a weathered wooden porch. The lawn was overgrown, and there were newspapers piled up by the front door. I knocked, not expecting an answer, but after a moment, I heard footsteps. The door opened to reveal a man in his 60s. He was unshaven, wearing a stained t-shirt and shorts. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he smelled of alcohol, but it was only 11 a.m. "Yeah," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Good morning." I began with my practiced presentation. "We're visiting neighbors today with an encouraging message from the Bible. In these difficult times, many people are wondering if there's any hope for the future." The man's expression changed. His eyes filled with tears. "Hope," he said. "You want to know about hope? My wife died 6 months ago. Cancer. 43 years we were married. 43 years. She was everything to me." I felt my prepared presentation crumble. This wasn't a potential Bible study or a magazine placement. This was a human being in profound pain. "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. "That must be incredibly difficult." "It is," he said, wiping his eyes. "I don't know how to go on. I don't know what the point is anymore. Some days I just want to be with her." He was crying now, openly and without shame. I felt tears forming in my own eyes. "Would you like us to pray with you?" I asked, reaching out to touch his arm. "Would you? Yes, please. I haven't prayed in years, but yes." I started to bow my head, but Brother Johnson quickly intervened. "We don't typically pray with people during our witnessing work," he said with a practiced smile. "But I have this excellent tract that discusses how to find comfort during times of grief. And this magazine has a wonderful article about the resurrection hope." The man looked confused, then hurt. "You won't pray with me?" "Well, you see," Brother Johnson continued, "we have a specific message to share, and we want to make sure we use our time effectively. But these publications will be much more helpful than anything we could say." I watched as the man's face hardened. The vulnerability disappeared, replaced by a cold emptiness. "I see," he said quietly. "Well, thank you, but I'm not interested in your magazines." He closed the door gently, but I could hear him crying on the other side. As we walked back to the car, Brother Johnson was already checking his watch and planning our next stop. "That was unfortunate," he said. "But you can't let every sob story derail your presentation. We have a work to do." A work to do. The words echoed in my mind as we drove to the next house. That encounter haunted me for weeks. I found myself lying awake at night, thinking about the man's tears, his desperate need for comfort, and our refusal to simply pray with him. What would it have cost us? 5 minutes? 10 minutes? Was our schedule really more important than human compassion? I began to notice other troubling patterns. During service meetings, conversations inevitably turned to numbers. How many hours did you get last month? How many placements? How many return visits? How many studies? The actual people we were supposedly serving seemed secondary to the statistics they represented. I started paying closer attention to how we talked about the people in our territory. Mrs. Patterson, the widow who had lost her husband, was described as a potential study. The college student was an interested one with good potential. The elderly man on Pine Street was unresponsive and probably not worth the time. Even Mrs. Walsh, my favorite return visit, was increasingly seen as a problem. During a service meeting, Sister Martinez asked about my Bible studies. "Well, I have one official study," I said, "and I'm working with Mrs. Walsh on Maple Street, but she's more interested in the social aspect than the biblical instruction." "How long have you been visiting her?" Sister Martinez asked. "About 4 months. 4 months with no progress toward baptism? Brother David, you need to be more direct with her. Either she's going to accept the truth or she's not. Don't waste time on people who just want to socialize." Waste time. The phrase stuck with me. Was spending time with a lonely widow a waste? Was offering human companionship and comfort without expecting anything in return somehow wrong? I began to dread my visits with Mrs. Walsh. Instead of enjoying our conversations, I felt pressure to make progress. I started pushing harder for her to attend meetings, to accept a formal Bible study, to make a commitment to the truth. "I enjoy learning about the Bible," she would say, "but I'm not ready for anything more than that. I hope you understand." I did understand, but I was being told that understanding wasn't enough. I needed results. The incident that finally shattered my faith in the field service arrangement happened on a Saturday morning in August. I was working with Brother Thompson, a ministerial servant who had been pioneering for 3 years. We had been assigned a territory in an older part of town where many of the residents were elderly or disabled. We came to a house where an elderly man answered the door. He was using a walker and moved slowly, but he was dressed neatly and seemed alert. When I began my presentation, he smiled and invited us in. "I'd love to talk about the Bible," he said. I don't get many visitors anymore." His name was Mr. Rodriguez, and he was 84 years old. He had been a construction worker his whole life, raised 5 children, and had been widowed for 10 years. He lived alone in the same house where he had raised his family. "I used to go to church," he told us, "but it got too hard to get there every week. I miss it, though. I miss talking about God." We sat in his living room, which was filled with family photos and religious artwork. He asked thoughtful questions about the Bible, shared stories from his life, and seemed genuinely grateful for our visit. "This is wonderful," he said after we had talked for about an hour. "Would you be willing to come back next week? I'd love to continue our conversation." I was about to say yes when Brother Thompson stood up. "We'd love to," he said, "but we need to ask you something important. Are you willing to make changes in your life based on what you learn from the Bible?" Mr. Rodriguez looked confused. "What kind of changes?" "Well, for example, do you celebrate Christmas? Birthdays? Do you vote in elections? Do you salute the flag?" "Well, yes, I suppose I do most of those things." "Is that wrong?" "According to the Bible, yes. And if you're not willing to stop doing those things, then there's really no point in our continuing to visit you." I watched as the joy drained from Mr. Rodriguez's face. He had been so happy to have visitors, so eager to discuss the Bible, and now he was being told he wasn't worth our time unless he was willing to completely change his lifestyle. "I see," he said quietly. "Well, I'm probably too old to change everything about how I live. But I really enjoyed talking with you." "We understand," Brother Thompson said, already heading toward the door. "Take care of yourself." As we left, I could see Mr. Rodriguez through his window, sitting alone again in his living room full of family photos. "That was a waste of time," Brother Thompson said as we walked to the car. "He's not interested in the truth, just in having company. We can't afford to spend time on people who aren't going to progress." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Mr. Rodriguez, about his eagerness to discuss the Bible, about his loneliness, about the way we had dismissed him so coldly. Was this really how Jesus would have handled the situation? I began to seriously question not just the methods we were using, but the entire premise of our work. Were we really there to help people, or were we there to recruit them? Were we motivated by love for our neighbors, or by the need to generate statistics for our reports? My 6th and final month as a pioneer was marked by a growing sense of disillusionment. I still maintained my schedule, still turned in my hours, still attended the meetings, but the fire was gone. I felt like I was going through the motions, acting out a role that no longer fit. My relationship with Mrs. Walsh became strained. Following advice from the other pioneers, I began pressuring her to attend meetings, to commit to a formal Bible study, to make a decision about the truth. She responded with hurt and confusion. "I thought we were friends," she said during what turned out to be our last visit. "I thought you enjoyed our conversations. But it seems like you only care about whether I join your religion." She was right, of course. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as a potential convert. The pressure to produce results had poisoned our relationship. I stopped visiting her after that. In my report, I marked her as no longer interested. My Bible study with the college student ended around the same time. He had begun asking difficult questions about the organization's history, questions about false predictions, changes in doctrine, and the treatment of former members. When I couldn't provide satisfactory answers, I was counseled to focus on the basics and not get sidetracked by apostate-influenced questioning. But his questions had awakened my own doubts. I began doing research on my own, reading books and articles that the organization discouraged. What I found was disturbing: a pattern of authoritarian control, failed predictions, and the systematic shunning of anyone who questioned the leadership. As my pioneer appointment came to an end in September, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that I wouldn't have to maintain the grueling schedule anymore. Sadness that my grand vision of saving lives had been replaced by the grinding reality of producing statistics. I didn't immediately leave the organization. The process was gradual, taking place over several months. I continued attending meetings, though less frequently. I continued participating in the field service, though with much less enthusiasm. I was going through the motions, trying to figure out what I really believed. The breaking point came in December, about 3 months after my pioneer appointment had ended. I was working with Brother Johnson again, covering the same territory we had worked earlier that year. We came to the house where the grieving widower had lived. The house was empty. A "for sale" sign was posted in the front yard, and the windows were dark. I asked a neighbor what had happened to the man who had lived there. "Oh, him," the neighbor said. "He died a couple months ago. Suicide. Poor guy never got over losing his wife." I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. The man who had begged us to pray with him, who had reached out for comfort in his darkest hour, had taken his own life. And we had been too busy with our work to spend 10 minutes offering him the human compassion he desperately needed. "That's too bad," Brother Johnson said when I told him. "But you can't save everyone. Some people are just determined to reject the truth." That was the moment I knew I was done. This wasn't about saving people. This wasn't about love. This was about numbers, statistics, and the organization's need to maintain its growth. I submitted my letter of disassociation 2 weeks later. The most telling part of my experience came after I left. I had expected some reaction from the people I had worked with for nearly a year. I had spent hundreds of hours with these people, shared meals with them, confided in them about my struggles and doubts. I had considered them friends, even family. But once I was officially out, the silence was deafening. No one called to check on me. No one knocked on my door to see how I was doing. No one sent a card or a letter expressing concern for my spiritual welfare. According to the organization's teachings, I was now spiritually dead, worthy only of their avoidance and contempt. The contrast was stark. When I was producing good numbers, attending meetings regularly, and maintaining my pioneer schedule, I was valued and praised. The moment I stopped being useful to the organization, I ceased to exist in their world. This confirmed what I had begun to suspect during my time as a pioneer. The organization's primary concern was not with individuals as human beings, but with individuals as statistics. As long as I was contributing to their numbers, hours, placements, studies, baptisms, I was valuable. Once I stopped producing, I was discarded. I thought about Mrs. Walsh, the lonely widow who had simply wanted companionship. I thought about Mr. Rodriguez, the elderly man who had been eager to discuss the Bible. I thought about the grieving widower who had begged us to pray with him. All of them had been dismissed as not interested or not worth the time, because they weren't likely to become baptized Jehovah's Witnesses. In the months following my departure, I began to research the organization more thoroughly. What I discovered was a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond my personal experience. The emphasis on statistics, the pressure to produce results, the devaluation of human relationships in favor of organizational goals, these weren't aberrations or local problems. They were systemic features of the organization's approach to evangelism. I read accounts from former pioneers around the world who had had similar experiences. The details varied, but the themes were consistent. The gradual realization that the work was more about numbers than people, the pressure to treat human beings as potential converts rather than individuals worthy of respect, and the ultimate discovery that the organization's primary concern was its own growth and survival. I also learned about the psychological techniques used to maintain control over members. The constant emphasis on urgency, Armageddon is coming soon, the discouragement of outside research, don't listen to apostates, the social pressure to conform, what will the brothers think, and the threat of shunning for those who questioned or left. These techniques were particularly effective on pioneers, who were held up as examples of spirituality and dedication. The time commitment required for pioneering made it difficult to maintain outside relationships or pursue independent interests. The constant activity left little time for reflection or critical thinking. The social approval that came with high service statistics created a powerful incentive to continue, even when doubts arose. As I reflected on my experience, I began to understand the real cost of the organization's approach to evangelism. It wasn't just the wasted time or the missed opportunities to help people. It was the systematic suppression of human empathy and compassion in favor of organizational goals. I had entered the pioneer work genuinely believing that I was helping people. I had wanted to offer comfort to those who were suffering, hope to those who were discouraged, and answers to those who were searching. But the organization's emphasis on results had gradually eroded those noble intentions. I had learned to see people as potential converts rather than human beings. I had been taught to value efficiency over compassion, statistics over relationships, and organizational goals over individual needs. I had become complicit in a system that used people's spiritual hunger and emotional vulnerability to advance its own agenda. The tragedy wasn't just that I had been deceived. The tragedy was that I had been turned into a deceiver, someone who approached vulnerable people with false promises of love and concern while actually evaluating them for their potential usefulness to the organization. I thought about all the people I had dismissed as not interested, or not worth the time. How many of them had been genuinely seeking spiritual guidance? How many had been lonely, hurting, or confused? How many had been turned away from any religious faith by their negative experience with Jehovah's Witnesses? The organization claimed to be doing a life-saving work, but I had seen how it actually treated people who were struggling to save their own lives. The grieving widower who had committed suicide was just one example. How many others had been similarly dismissed when they didn't fit the organization's narrow definition of a good prospect? Leaving the organization was both liberating and terrifying. I had spent most of my adult life within its structures, and suddenly I was free to think, read, and believe whatever I chose. But I was also isolated from the only community I had known, and I had to rebuild my understanding of spirituality, morality, and human relationships from the ground up. One of the most difficult aspects of the recovery process was dealing with the guilt and shame I felt about my participation in the organization's activities. I had to confront the reality that I had hurt people, that I had participated in a system that exploited vulnerable individuals, and that I had allowed my own need for approval and belonging to override my basic human compassion. I began reaching out to some of the people I had encountered during my pioneer service. I found Mrs. Walsh's phone number and called her. She was initially cautious, but when I explained that I had left the organization and wanted to apologize for the way I had treated her, she was gracious and forgiving. "I knew you were a good person," she said. "I could see that you were struggling with something. I'm glad you found your way out." We began meeting regularly again, but this time as genuine friends rather than as evangelist and prospect. Our conversations were richer and more honest than they had ever been when I was trying to convert her. I also tried to find Mr. Rodriguez, the elderly man who had been so eager to discuss the Bible, but I learned that he had died the previous winter. I attended his funeral, though I didn't know anyone there. I felt I owed him that much. Now, 15 years later, I can look back on my pioneer experience with a clearer perspective. I understand that most of the people I worked with were sincere believers who genuinely thought they were doing the right thing. They had been indoctrinated into a system that valued organizational loyalty over human compassion, but they weren't malicious or deliberately deceptive. The real tragedy is that the organization's structure and teachings systematically corrupted good intentions. People who entered the ministry with genuine desire to help others were gradually transformed into recruiters whose primary concern was generating statistics for the organization. This transformation was achieved through a combination of psychological manipulation, social pressure, and the gradual erosion of critical thinking skills. Pioneers were kept so busy with organizational activities that they had little time to reflect on what they were actually doing. They were surrounded by fellow believers who reinforced the organization's teachings and discouraged questioning. They were rewarded for producing results and punished for showing too much independent thinking. The emphasis on urgency, Armageddon is coming soon, created a constant state of anxiety that made it easier to justify harsh or insensitive treatment of people who didn't respond positively to the message. The belief that only Jehovah's Witnesses would survive the coming destruction made it easier to dismiss those who rejected the organization's teachings as being unworthy of salvation. My experience as a pioneer taught me several important lessons about the nature of religious authority, the dangers of groupthink, and the importance of maintaining personal integrity even under pressure. First, I learned that good intentions are not enough to justify harmful actions. The fact that I genuinely believed I was helping people didn't excuse the ways I had hurt them. The organization's claim to be doing a life-saving work didn't justify its treatment of people as potential converts rather than human beings worthy of respect. Second, I learned that organizational loyalty and moral behavior are not the same thing. The organization demanded that its members prioritize its goals over their own conscience, their own relationships, and their own understanding of right and wrong. This created a situation where people could participate in harmful activities while telling themselves they were being righteous. Third, I learned the importance of maintaining personal relationships and outside perspectives. The organization's emphasis on associating only with fellow believers and avoiding worldly influences created an echo chamber that made it difficult to recognize problems or inconsistencies in the organization's teachings. Finally, I learned that genuine spiritual growth requires the freedom to question, to doubt, and to change one's mind. The organization's intolerance for questioning and its punishment of those who left created an environment where spiritual growth was actually discouraged. As I finish writing this account, I'm struck by the complexity of my feelings about that period of my life. I regret the pain I caused to people like Mrs. Walsh, Mr. Rodriguez, and the grieving widower. I regret the opportunities one missed to offer genuine help and comfort to people who needed it. I regret the years I spent in service to an organization that valued statistics over human beings. But I also recognize that the experience taught me valuable lessons about the importance of personal integrity, the dangers of unquestioned authority, and the need to treat every person with dignity and respect regardless of their potential usefulness to my goals. The man who knocked on doors as a pioneer 15 years ago was sincere but naive. He genuinely believed he was saving lives, but he was actually participating in a system that exploited people's spiritual hunger for organizational gain. The process of recognizing this truth was painful but ultimately liberating. Today, I still try to help people when I can, but I do it without ulterior motives. I don't evaluate people based on their potential usefulness to any organization or cause. I don't dismiss their concerns or needs if they don't fit my agenda. I try to treat each person I encounter as a unique individual worthy of respect and compassion. The field service experience taught me that the most important question to ask about any religious or humanitarian work is not how many people are we reaching, but how are we treating the people we encounter. Statistics can be manipulated, reports can be inflated, and numbers can be made to say whatever we want them to say. But the way we treat individual human beings, especially those who are vulnerable, lonely, or in pain, reveals the true nature of our motivations and the real value of our work. The organization I once served claimed to be motivated by love, but its actions revealed a primary concern with growth, control, and self-preservation. The people I encountered during my pioneer service deserved better than that. They deserved to be treated as human beings rather than potential converts, as individuals worthy of respect rather than statistics to be reported. I hope that by sharing this account, I can help others recognize the difference between genuine spiritual ministry and organizational recruitment. I hope it will encourage people to question any group that values loyalty over conscience, statistics over compassion, and organizational goals over human needs. Most importantly, I hope it will remind us all that every person we encounter, regardless of their religion, their background, or their potential usefulness to our goals, deserves to be treated with dignity, respect, and genuine human compassion. That's a lesson I wish I had learned before I became a pioneer, but I'm grateful I learned it at all. The numbers game is ultimately empty. The statistics we generate, the reports we file, and the goals we achieve mean nothing if we lose our humanity in the process. The real measure of any spiritual work is not how many people we recruit, but how well we love the people we encounter along the way. That's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're knocking on doors, working in a soup kitchen, or simply trying to be a good neighbor. People are not numbers. They are not statistics. They are not potential converts or useful resources. They are human beings created in the image of God, and they deserve to be treated as such. I failed to understand that during my time as a pioneer, but I understand it now. And perhaps that understanding, hard one though it was, makes the pain of that experience worthwhile.